Salute, your name is I am Rubenus, and today we're talking about a game design concept or flaw that I like to call cognitive overload. Now, cognitive overload is similar to what it sounds, is where there's too much going on the screen to be able to pay attention or focus on it. Now, cognitive overload is particularly a big problem with people that have any sort of mental difficulties with computation, with thinking, with anything along those lines, and those could just be by birth, they could also be by age, they could be just by certain things. Some people have problems focusing on different colors because they're colorblind, and having too many things of one color, or having things to move to match, or whatever going on can overload them. Now, typically it's not too much of an issue for something like this on screen, where there's a lot of things moving, but they're moving slow enough and they're spaced out far enough, and generally you can figure out what's going on and follow along. You can try to rush it and you can get screwed, or you can basically take your time and follow along and make it easier for you if needed. However, there are times where there's just way too much on screen for even those who don't have any major impediments, any severe disabilities, and maybe just have slight or just pretty much non-existent, or they would consider themselves not having any sort of mental disabilities, where this becomes a problem because now as you look on screen there's way too much moving and there's way too much to consider. You have to figure out where you're going, where you've been, and where you're going to be, because you have to figure out where each of these enemies are, which of each of the platforms and all of these mines. And that's where the cognitive overload becomes, is because you can no longer look at the entire screen and figure out where you're supposed to go. You can't really rush it. You have to take your time and basically a lot of luck and guessing to try to figure it out, because it's just too much for any human brain to realistically overcome. So you basically just have to take a guess, and you have all these problems where you die because there's just too much happening. To prevent cognitive overload, you basically need to look at your screen and think, is there too much on screen? Can I look at the entire screen at the center and basically focus on most of the things that are happening? Obviously, you don't need to focus on everything and need to be able to see everything that's going on, but can I go through this simply as a new player and be able to just maneuver through it and not be stressed out? Part of the cognitive overload is that it does stress your mind out, because your mind is literally overloaded. Your brain is trying to focus, it's trying to do the thing you're trying to do, but because you're overloading it and there's too much going on, you're freaking out, and that's where your brain comes into an issue. Now, some people have this easier than others, where they can focus on many things and can multitask, others not so much, but that's where part of the game design flaw comes in, is that you need to kind of plan around for the general audience, not just for the people who have these great minds who can multitask and focus on so many things at once. To fix cognitive overload in some of your levels, if you've realized that there's just too much happening on screen, it's realistically too much for anybody who hasn't designed the game, planned it, tested it for, 30 hours. To be able to realistically do, the best thing to do is look at the level. Can you put stationary hazards instead of mobile ones? Can you remove some of the enemies? Can you make the enemies bigger? Can you reduce the amount of hazards that they would have to look at? The big one for me is when I look around at my levels, when I look at anything I've taught or designed, I look at, is it possible to get through this? Can you look at this and not immediately become overwhelmed? And that's part of when I was teaching. When I initially taught a topic, whatever it was, I'd start out easy because you don't want to overload them, and then I would work myself to complex. And there's a certain level where some people, no matter how much they've trained, will be overwhelmed even at the mastery level of a subject, because it is just too much for your brain to handle. So you need to look at it and go, can I do anything about this? Can I reduce the size of the level? Can I reduce the amount of enemies? Can I do this or that? And basically you want to reduce the amount of things the player needs to think about at an immediate level. It doesn't mean that you need to replace all the aspects of the level or you need to remove everything, but at the immediate section. So within about 3 to 5 seconds, if I can remove those thoughts that they need to think about every 3 to 5 seconds, it can generally help ease that cognitive overload and make it so that they're not constantly flipping out and freaking out and constantly getting frustrated because there's just way too much happening on screen. I talked about color blindness a little bit as an accessibility issue because it is leading into the cognitive overload, as does sound, as does movement, as does all sorts of things. Having a character having to do 17 different commands, such as fighting games, can have cognitive overload. That's why fighting games have generally a smaller audience. Not only does it take time to learn the combos and all sorts of things, but having to do those combos in such a short time can be cognitive overload, even if not necessarily a disability. So those are things to think about, and for anybody who's experienced cognitive overload, either majorly where they've put down a game or refused to play a level or just given up in some way or had to play a level over and over and over again, or mildly where, maybe you just got frustrated and it took a while to beat the level, please put in the comment section below flow so we can have those experiences and learn from these kind of mistakes in game design development, and so that we can learn from them and move on and have better things. Obviously, as I mentioned before, there's ways to keep things in the game and also not have cognitive overload, but it takes a lot of design, it takes a lot of testing, and that's something that we generally just need to work through. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. Please leave comments of things that you've experienced, things that I've gotten wrong, or comments that you just generally want to get out about game design itself, or particularly about cognitive overload. But until next time, Wale te omnes.